Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Risk assessment guidelines will enable the EPA to achieve consistency in the conduct of chemical risk assessments and will help avoid manipulation of evidence and assumptions to achieve predetermined results. It's my understanding that existing risk assessments guidelines are out of date and do not offer critical guidance that relates to current and evolving risk sciences. It's also painfully apparent that the EPA risk assessors do not consistently follow all aspects of their existing guidelines. For example, the Science Committee's investigation into EPA's assessment of glyphosate found significant flaws in the scientific process of re-registering chemicals that warrants further examination. I believe that updated risk assessment guidelines should contain clear criteria for causal analysis so that there is little room as possible for subjective judgment that reflects the policy leanings of the analyst. The guidelines should identify, through careful evidence integration, the conclusions that have the strongest scientific support. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. White. Do you believe the EPA should update and revise its risk assessment guidelines? Do you believe that the development of updated risk assessment guidelines and adherence to these guidelines will inject more objective scientific rigor into EPA's chemical risk assessments, and will that make the development of risk assessments more transparent?
I thank you, Congressman, for that question. Transparent and consistent framework for evaluating chemicals is necessary. It needs to be transparent, and like I said, it needs to be consistent and science-based. As the science changes, risk evaluations need to be updated. So do the processes that are used. I mentioned 2016, Congress passed the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, which requires the EPA to make its decisions using the best available science and a weight of evidence process. What that means is a weight of evidence utilizes all the available science. It clearly identifies the criteria that it will use to identify the available data. It evaluates the quality of that data. And I think it's important to note when we talk about the quality of the data, just to go back to something Dr. Holt said about studies funded by industry and whether they should be discounted. I do not feel that a study should be discounted solely based on the funding authority. It should be reviewed and evaluated based on the merits of the actual scientific content in the study design and the value that that information will provide to the assessment. When EPA or any other agency evaluates the available scientific information, it needs to determine whether or not they have high quality information, looking across the board at all studies. One of the reasons that it's important to do a weight of evidence process is because it allows the agency to look across the board at all the available evidence to evaluate the quality of that evidence and then use that information to integrate and make decisions. This is information both on available human data, on the animal data that might be relevant to human exposures, and any mechanistic data that will tell us about how a chemical may be acting in the body. Okay.
And how would you suggest risk assessment guidelines account for uncertainties in the scientific evidence? When and how is it appropriate to use default assumptions?
So when scientific information is available, so when we actually have human data or animal data, that information should be used instead of a default. When we're looking specifically at uncertainties, sometimes in research we have animal data and we may not have available human information. So we need to have and be able to account for how that animal data is relevant or not relevant to the human exposure incident.
Okay, and then one last thing. Do you believe that exposure assessments should be included in revised risk assessments guidelines?
Exposure is a key piece of the risk assessment process. So not only do you need to look at the toxicity information, but also whether or not that toxicity is relevant to actual human exposures.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anybody else like to add that?
Mr. Babin, if I may,
Yes.
well, first of all, in your first question, it may be true that the risk assessment guidelines need to be updated. But I just wanted to make sure that it didn't seem that I was implying that, industrial research should be discounted on the face of it. Maybe Dr. White thought I said that. I certainly didn't mean that.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? With that, I will yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.